All right. Can everyone hear me? Sounds good. All right, we're going to get started with our last panel of the day. Give yourself a round of applause for hanging in there all day. And we're going to have a very authentic and transparent conversation. At least my panelists may not know it's going to be authentic and transparent. But we're really going to continue this conversation, this dialogue around what will it take for us to continue to participate in this conversation, lean in as organization, and build collaboration and a coalition and support that supports families from being stable and thriving. So again, as Esther said earlier, I don't really need to be here to moderate. You have three amazing individuals who are leading organizations to greatness. So I'm going to ask each of these esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. And imagine that we're having a fireside chat. So there's a fireplace in between Alana and Esther. And we want this to truly be a dialogue. I have some questions to get us started, but we really want to push the envelope on what would it take for us to continue this conversation. What's the policy kind of conversation that we should be having? We touched a little bit early on what does the race and equity agenda look like in this work. And we're just going to continue to build on that. So I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and their organization. And we'll start with Alana.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alana Green. I am the Executive Director of the St. Louis Housing Authority. I've been there a little over a year, and so I'm still in the learning phase, but I hope to bring information that is useful to you all today. Thank you for having me.
So again, I'm Esther Shin, President of Urban Strategies. We are a 40-plus-year-old national nonprofit. Our corporate headquarters are here in St. Louis. We serve directly about 35,000 families across the country in 20 cities in the contiguous U.S. and 2 territories outside of the contiguous U.S. Indirectly, we're serving about 500,000 individuals, about 100,000 families around the country. And as I said earlier, we focus on essentially not the non-housing components of community transformation. Those families that we are serving are largely living in subsidized housing, and for the most part, deeply subsidized housing. And so our mission and our goal is to ensure that every child and family we serve is not only stable, but also thriving.
Thank you, Esther. My name is Wole Coxum, founder and CEO of Mocafy, Mobility Capital Finance, which is a mobile banking platform that's focused on bringing marginalized communities who are suffering from a market failure, essentially, where banks aren't serving 30, 40, 50, 60% of our communities with a viable low-cost option so they can become a part of the digital economy.
Thank you for that. So we'll start with the first question, everyone please chime into this question, but I'm going to start with Esther because she asked that this be the first question. So we've been getting a lot of attention around race and equity. It's been a trending topic. It's been part of the political debates. So I've been wondering, how can we use this conversation around rental credit reporting and this policy agenda, creating a policy agenda to help strengthen the outcomes related to decreasing the wealth gap?
So I asked, Donovan came up with the questions, and they're all fabulous questions. And this one, it stood out for me in particular because, over the 40-some years that we have been in business, we've learned a great number of things. One, that there is a sweet spot between physical transformation, human capital investment, and community engagement. That in order to really sustain community transformation, those 3 things are critical. We've also learned that, and it shouldn't surprise anyone, and if it does surprise you, I don't quite know what to say, that historic racism has prevented our families from succeeding. And we have to be really honest about that and very direct about how we challenge that, and that we really need to look at not only, again, the iceberg, the things that you see, but the things that you don't see. And for us, that is systems disruption. And I think there's a real opportunity here to disrupt systems through what we've been talking about all day. when we first got involved in the rent reporting and the rent solutions conversation, it was really largely because, I had no idea that when you pay rent, it does not show up on your credit history. I learned this a few years ago. I haven't been a renter in a really long time. So if you're not renting, who knew? And so this seemed like a real loss of opportunity for our families, because there is a mental model that our families, because they lack financial capacity today, that they don't pay their rent on time. And that is a myth. The reality of it is that families that are living in subsidized housing, particular public housing, pay their rent on time and should get credit for it. And if they got credit for it, imagine what the possibility would be, especially today where, storefronts are closing. A lot of our neighborhoods don't have grocery stores. Families don't have access to a lot of things. And, the solution has always been in these communities, in much of the work that we do, when we're going through a planning process, in every community, residents say, we want a coffee shop, we want our own grocery store, we want our own in our neighborhood. And the reality of it is that developers and grocery stores are unwilling to come to neighborhoods that are not at the cusp of some major transformation. So how powerful would it be for our families if they had access to credit that brought to their door things like groceries, right? By and large, I order most things through Amazon now, right? You can get anything, toilet paper, you can just about anything. But how powerful would it be if our families suddenly got access to those kinds of just ordinary products that we take for granted that are accessible to us? And even as a transit solution, right? Things like zip cars and the bike sharing, you need credit. And so how powerful would it be if things that our families are doing every day without even thinking about paying their rent, paying their utilities on time, really increasing the possibilities that they have and what they could access in terms of real economic and financial capacity.
Wale.
So you make me smile as you talk about that, because from a policy perspective, you actually see a lot of cities institute policies. Actually, Boston did it early on, where they're requiring stores to accept cash. And New York City passed some legislation along the same lines. And I think that's missing the point, right? Because the point is, how do you move people into a digital economy so they can take advantage of scooters and bikes and things like that? Let's spend our political capital trying to figure that out, as opposed to sort of perpetuating marginalization of certain communities staying in the cash economy. From a policy perspective, I also think this rent reporting ties to what some people on the Hill are talking about, which is the biggest tax break, or one of the biggest tax breaks in the United States, is the deduction of mortgage interest for homes, right? And that really is a middle class, upper middle class tax break. There is a movement on the Hill that says, hey, you should have rent payments, a portion of your rent payment, tax deductible, right? And can you imagine if that actually were the case, and you had rent reporting, paying your rent would actually become as important come tax time as collecting all of your interest payments over the course of the year for your mortgage payment. And I actually think so there is a really interesting sort of dichotomy in my mind, or a connection, maybe not dichotomy, connection between a policy like that and rent reporting, which would even bolster and strengthen the power that renters have in terms of their ability to get credit, no pun intended, for their rent payments.
I would say from a housing authority perspective, the St. Louis Housing Authority, we are kind of late to the game as far as rental reporting and just the discussion on rental reporting. We've been talking about it the last year or so, but the more and more I research it, the more and more I know it's about credit invisibility and how help residents build their wealth. One thing in particular that I'm thinking about now is basically, as our residents go to get loans, the fact that a lot of them are credit invisible, they get the highest interest rates. They get sometimes denied for loans, and that's loans that could help them buy a car to get to work. And so it's a kind of a perpetual process. And so really rental credit reporting really is the key to a lot of our residents gaining that wealth and also the motivation sometimes to get up and become self-sufficient. So that's what we see the most. And when they have high interest rates, they can't save, they can't provide and do other things for their families. So a lot of these things have been a part of our thought process and why we should go and move forward in the rent reporting area.
Thank you for that. In our system, we follow Myers-Briggs. My J is saying, bring this to closure, but my P is saying, I have so many more questions about this. But I think, Wale, you hit on something around promising practice and things that you're hearing on the Hill, a lot about how do we tie this asset building with rental reporting and give a credit.
Yeah.
What other things are you seeing across the country that really are promising practices or ideas or policy ideas that could really strengthen the work that we're trying to do collectively?
That's a good question. So I think there's no magic bullet in terms of one size fits all. Each city's doing something different that I've seen. You've got places like Boston, they say they want to have 660 credit scores for 25,000 people by the year 2020 something. Which I think is a great, just sort of a policy perspective, it's an easy thing. People can get their head around it, and it's something that you can rally people around. At the same time, we're seeing we're seeing lots of conversations around universal basic income. It's a little bit off the beaten path, but the guaranteed income, and Chicago has a conversation about it. They actually rolled it out in California. I'm on a commission talking about it in Newark, New Jersey, and they're talking about it in New York City. But what's interesting is if you're able to put something like that in place, and then you tie in these wraparound things like rent reporting, it allows for a pathway for people to sort of begin to move forward. At the same time, we're seeing serious conversations around how to expand the number of black entrepreneurs, specifically in New York City. And what I've been talking, I'm part of a commission with the Small Business Commissioner talking about just this. We're about to launch a report. I'll send it to you guys when it comes out. But the point is, you can't even think about becoming an entrepreneur unless you have access to a bank account and you have a way of building your credit. And then so we keep bringing back to the point of this is an important stepping stone to what it is you're trying to do. And the final thing I would say is, I think I mentioned earlier, working with Section 8 housing authority, the folks within housing authorities who focus on Section 8, how do we help in their transition of people from dependence to independence, giving them access to their credit score? I must give a big shout out to Equifax. We're able to make Vantage scores available to people on our platform for free, right? And then we say, and oh, by the way, you can fix it or improve it, if not fix it, but you can improve it if you begin to use rent payments as a way to provide more visibility to you. So we actually really anchor to, from a policy perspective, make rent payments a part of what people are doing as a basic, like brushing your teeth and report your rent kind of thing, because that can unlock so many different things.
So Esther, if I could ask you just to build on what Wale says, stated, Urban Strategies, Inc., Erica should be happy, USI, got it right, has really been intentional about diving into this policy framework and space over the last 3 to 4 years, and that's really intentional under your leadership. Why are you feeling that as a practitioner organization, you really want to have a policy agenda focus, and what is that focus in service to?
So, for many, many years, we were just on the ground working really hard, and our theory of change for many, many, many years was just work as hard as you can. That was our theory of change. And that was great. It was great. It's good work, right? It's solid solid work. And yet, all the work that staff at USI were doing on the ground were not necessarily connecting to any sort of policy agenda. And so oftentimes we were seeing policies get implemented that were universal in nature and were not necessarily addressing the need on the ground by our families. And so for us, our practitioner work is what keeps us honest and informs the policy work. So our practitioner work helps us understand what's truly happening inside the home, because, and no offense to the wonky folks out there, there's definitely a place for it. We love the wonky folks because it gives us some capacity where we don't have it. But I would say to the wonky folks, it's got to be informed by something, right? It's got to be informed by something that's actually taking place on the ground, and so really wanting to, the last few years, focusing on not decreasing our practitioner work, but actually building the capacity inside our organization for that practitioner work to inform something that needs to change, whether it be systems, that federal systems or local systems. Donovan can talk more about some of the work that he's been doing with Congressperson Fudge's office. Between the 60%, 80% AMI, there's a real, there's a cliff there for our families that are, making too much, but not enough. And so what are the solutions for those families, especially when you're talking about the Midwest? Andrew has some different challenges in Seattle, right, than we do here in the Midwest. And so, how can we really support those families that are right there? And credit is, definitely tied to that. We're talking about moving those families into home ownership. And, we want to be informing things like what's going on in St. Paul, where the school district is providing housing vouchers to their students, right? Really seeing the connection between education and housing. And so more and more of our work is informing those kinds of policies, and I continue that. I see that work continuing.
Thank you. So Alana, you said that you're a year into your new role at the Housing Authority. In your previous role, you managed the city's community development funding stream, which is you used home funds, CDBG funds, and now you're on the other side of housing, running the Housing Authority. What are some of the things that you're seeing that are consistent across both landscapes? And what are some of the differences you're seeing?
I definitely see more similarities than differences. I would say, for the most part, a few things that stick out is family self-sufficiency. You see that through CDBG. You also see that through the programs offered under public housing. And you also see the use of technology as a key in a lot of the CDBG programs. There really aren't a lot of differences. I would say for public housing, of course, a lot of the funding comes directly to us, and so it allows us to do things without worrying about being funded or not funded from year to year. But I would say, as far as technology, HUD has done a great job of kind of laying a framework for housing authorities. They have a program that we're actually a part of the cohort called Connect Home USA. And one thing that that program does is it connects us with people who will help us bring Wi-Fi to our residents. And one thing that we know for certain is that access to Wi-Fi and internet are key to checking your credit report, to being able to check your bank statements online, working and going to school, things like that. So all these things help build wealth, help build capacity and self-sufficiency. And so again, those are really the main similarities and not many differences. I think HUD did a good job of connecting all of the programs together so we work well with one another.
And Alana's being modest. The St. Louis Housing Authority also created a pathway to connect small grocery stores and several of their business, especially in areas that were food deserts. So they're using their real estate to really ensure that families are stable and thriving. Do we have any questions from the audience?
So, it's curious from an on-the-ground perspective, the potential change from mobile applications, and is it really a game changer in terms of access? So you don't necessarily need the bank to open up a local branch. Do you really think, from an on-the-ground perspective, that mobile phones will be a game changer in terms of what you see right now? And from a Mocafy perspective, how does it change the mobile applications and technology? How does it change the cost structure of financial services? Is it a major change to allow more services to now underserved people so they can be done profitably?
You want to go first or want me to go first?
Sure, you go first.
No. I go first. Okay, so that's a great question. Our strategy, just to give you a sense of scale, I think I mentioned earlier when I was at JP Morgan, we were trying to move people from using the branch to using technology, mobile phones and ATM machines. Depositing money at a branch, numbers directionally correct, costs $5, and to deposit money in an ATM machine costs 50 cents, maybe a little bit less. And so the economics of that are significant. The difference, which is why, with all due respect to JP Morgan, they shut down their product. It's focused, it's called Liquid. Gordon shut it down a couple years ago. That's appropriate for this community, because he's just like, we can't afford to have that. Our approach has been, Gordon is the number 2 guy at JP Morgan, Gordon Smith. So our approach is such that we want to push the boundaries of technology to the best that we can, and that's where partnership comes in. So we got to keep our costs low, because 50 cents or less for these kind of services, we can afford that. And then if there's something that is a higher value that requires in-person or branch interaction, that we then find the right partner who can do it that shares our values. And we've pushed the envelope, and that's also holds true for financial literacy and coaching and things like that. There are a lot of great organizations, some of you are in this room, that can do that really, really well. That's expensive work to do, and if we can add value by bringing lots of customers that would benefit from the services that you provide, that's a big checkbox from our perspective. The number of minority deposit institutions of all flavors, there are about, I think the number is 500 of them across the country, credit unions, things like that. And as I have done my own personal analysis of some of them that are in low and moderate income communities, they're banks, but they really are, it's a tale of two cities. They're either check cashers, because the communities that they're in, they're just got to cash checks and stuff like that, or send money to overseas. And then they've got a balance sheet which is really goofy of things that they have, like student loans or mortgages in their community that they're not necessarily originating, but they need to have those assets on their books to sort of keep their bank status. And this is particularly true in black banks. The vision that we have is like, and oh, by the way, having those low dollar balance accounts that many people have in our communities, because you all know the statistics in terms of most people, half people couldn't come up with $400 if they had an emergency or whatever, and they're treating their accounts like check cashers. That's actually costing the bank money because they have brick and mortar. And some statistics are just $3. It's cost the bank $3 a month just to have these accounts. I think through technology, we can go to a bank and say, hey, all these accounts that are just transactional accounts, put them on our platform, electronic, make it available, and then turn your brick and mortar into something that's of high value, mortgages, appropriately priced loans, helping with entrepreneur account or small business accounts. That I think is the right model, but it all falls apart if a mobile-first platform tries to build out its own brick and mortar. You're no longer able to effectively and appropriately build a sustainable business model.
As for technology and its role in what we're seeing on the ground, definitely it has been hugely influential. 20 years ago, or 20 plus years ago, when I first started out in community development, when you were talking about engagement, if you talked about technology, you were largely criticized because, does everyone have a computer? Does everyone have access to internet? Today, if technology is not a part of an engagement or economic strategy, you're considered old-fashioned. Especially if we're talking about engaging young and elderly. The elderly are using technology a lot more than I think we assume. And as youth for sure are using technology extremely broadly. So if we're talking about just from an engagement standpoint, we're seeing a lot of our communities now having apps that are kind of like Nextdoor, where they're learning about the amenities in their community, figuring out where to go for, where the closest bus stops are, how to stay connected with one another. So I think technology is in large part, it's just an automatic, and we're no longer talking about neighborhood flyers and sandwich signs. It's still a tool, but by and large, you're getting to the masses using technology.
Yeah, I totally agree with Esther. Technology is definitely a main part and main focus of how we engage with our residents. I would say not just technology is important, but access to low-cost equipment is important for our residents. Most of our residents utilize their cell phones to access the internet. But you can't do your homework on a cell phone. You can't really create a spreadsheet on your cell phone easily, I should say. And so what we're trying to do is to bring those tools to our residents, but then also to train them. Because what we found, in particular with our senior population, they do Facebook really well. They do things like that very well, but they don't know how to navigate an actual computer. And so they're not able to access services related to their health care. They're not able to access email so they can get adequate representation and communication with their families. And so that's really key. So technology in itself is great, but having them have tools in their homes is what's key for us. We offer computer labs in our buildings, but they're not utilized because not everyone wants to do their banking between 8 and 5. They want to do it kind of whenever they want to. So we're trying to now get Wi-Fi in every household. That is our goal. And access to low-cost equipment to do that as well.
So, Alana and Esther, building on this conversation about access and technology and the resident pool that you all represent, I'm sitting here wondering, like, what's the conversation that we should be having with families about pushing this issue forward, right? And especially understanding, like, sometimes feeling very disenfranchised by processes, or new things won't benefit me. And so there's all of these, what we say in our system, mental models that we hold about this process. And there's behavior changes, right? If I grew up in a household with my grandmother who, Grandma Susie, put all of her money underneath her mattress, right? That's a behavior that I learned that I now have to figure out what are ways for me to do differently. So what do you think is the conversations that we should be having with families around the importance of this issue?
What's really worked for us is to not really have a specific conversation on a specific topic, but to engage them more on a social level and have those resources available to them once they come. So for example, we had just 2 weeks ago, we had a pizza party for our seniors at a development, and we had all of the references related to technology there. So it was kind of an outing for them, but they also learned about our Connect Home program and the things that we're doing for Wi-Fi. So we know that what we know doesn't work is having classes on a particular topic. We don't get as many participants, but what we do know is if we make it more of a kind of a social event and bring the resources to them, that it's better received. And so, yeah, we don't really look to have classes or sessions in the traditional sense any longer.
So I'd say, one, get over the notion that just because you might have, you might be challenged in terms of your financial capacity, that your engagement looks any different than anyone else. Right? I just went to mobile banking like a year ago. Right? So this assumption that just because a family lives in public housing, that the barrier between that family and technology is somehow different than mine. I was super irritated when my hospital went to electronic records, and I can't remember passwords, and it's just irritating. So I think that divide The mental models around that divide are, exactly that. They're mental models. And this engagement that Alana talks about is important. It's got to be organic. What's going to engage one family is not what's going to engage the next family. So there's no silver bullet around the education and outreach piece. It's going to be something that's constant. What makes me less irritated about internet banking is not going to be the same thing as that next family. So not assuming that all, again, these mental models that just because you live in public housing, that you somehow have this special barrier as opposed to, say, those of us that are living in market rate units.
Actually, you're a great example of adoption. Well, you're a great example in many regards, great role model. But in terms of adoption of technology, the first adopters tend to be the lower end of the income scale. Right, they rely on cell phones, as you talked about, and so TD Bank did analysis in terms of who are their most engaged customers from mobile. It was the lower end customer, right? And so I actually think the adoption rates are higher as you go down because they don't have any options, or they have fewer options and are required to be more innovative and creative to get stuff done. And particularly if you live in a banking desert, where a lot of so. In New York, statistic that I love to quote, for every 1,000 majority households in New York City, there are 4 bank branches. For every 1,000 majority household communities in New York City, there's 1, right? And the banking needs of folks who are majority minority are no different than the banking needs of the majority community in New York City. They're just not there. So that's when you've got to be innovative to come up with different kinds of solutions. So I think the mental model is you can actually get more adoption from folks, but the key, in my humble opinion, is most of the digital solutions aren't geared towards that community, right? And so as a result, you're going to have low adoption because people aren't focused on providing solutions for people who live in public housing because they don't think there's a market there, so they'll make the investment. And oh, by the way, it requires investment to take technology and move into those communities. And so that's where we think there's a great market opportunity for us and anybody else who wants to play. How do you reimagine this community as a meaningful market that is worth delivering quality solutions to that you can deliver electronically?
So, Willie, can you build on that a little bit for me? So, what resonated for me, what you said was around penetration, right? And for folks who provide financial literacy, please don't take what I'm about to say offensively, right? We talk about, I started to think about when I worked at the Housing Authority or in my current role at Urban Strategies, the amount of financial institutions who come to us saying that they want to provide financial literacy courses. And we say, well, last year, 7 other banks provided the same service, and what's different about your service? So when you start thinking about how that saturation, what does it look like to be really thoughtful about the response to those communities so it's not a saturation issue where they believe they're getting the same type of conversation over and over again?
And I'd love to hear from your on-the-ground perspective the answer to that question. From my vantage point, there are a couple of things. One, banks do that because it makes them feel good. But the reality in terms of their interest in serving that customer and having those individuals walk through the branch, in my humble opinion, is low. So they sort of get credit for having the literacy, but then the overall impact, it's unclear. Second, I actually think that financial literacy is something that you don't pay attention to till you need it, right? It's not like you can talk to somebody about, hey, you should start saving money for a home. That may go in one ear, out the other, unless someone's got a mindset that says, hey, I'm ready to start making that commitment to get my first home or whatever it is. And so I think there's a little bit of timeliness of the information when somebody wants it. I worry a little bit that there's a lot of money that's spent on financial literacy that may not be effectively spent. And that's the best, that's a diplomatic way of saying it. And then the final thing is I actually think there is a level of connectivity with the people that you're trying to educate, right? And so we have a great example in our business where we displaced a couple of name brand banks, a couple of name brand credit unions who were providing financial literacy because the people that were doing the training were not accessible to the people they were training. Said another way, someone who was training them didn't have the cultural fluency with the person that was being trained. And so as a result, they were not able to make the connection, and the information was not absorbed effectively. And so sometimes, which is the case for diversity, right, which is you need different voices who are making the pitch so people can say, oh, that person looks like me, or they've got experiences that I can relate to, or they have an experience, they are someone that I can empathize with. And I think it's only until you get that, if someone's wide open for a financial literacy conversation, you got to make sure that the message is right and the messenger is right.
I agree. In particular with financial literacy, I agree. Not every resident is ready. We find a lot of, different levels. If you look at kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are some people that are still at the basic level. They're worried about safety, housing, water, things like that. But then you have people that are ready to kind of move up the tier, and there might not be very many people at that tier. And so I tell staff people all the time, just because 5 people show up does not mean that it was not a success. Those are the ones that are ready. I also tell staff repeatedly, you can't do programming based on what you think residents need. You have to actually go out and talk to the residents, do a survey, just to know, because a lot of them, again, they need mental health services, or they need actual health services, things that, kind of trump the need for financial literacy. And so that's really the key, is knowing what your residents need and being able to implement those particular activities, and not thinking that you're a failure because only a few people show up.
Okay. So coalition building, as we all know, takes a tremendous amount of capacity. This is the second annual event, and there's several people and actors or individuals who we believe should be in the room. So as you think about coalition building around this subject, and we can dream, who additionally would you have at this table as we continue to build our pipeline towards success?
I would say I think public housing residents are missing right now. I think having residents in the room could bring a valuable perspective to the rental reporting discussion. I think I'd love to hear from them what they think, and I'm going to probably bring that to them and ask them what they think about this concept, and answer questions, hear their opinions. But I think residents are always key, and in particular, as Esther mentioned, youth and seniors. I think they're always the least likely to attend events sometimes, and so I'd like to kind of bring them in the room to see what they think about that as well.
Ditto to what Alana said.
And I would just add, and we saw a little bit earlier with the general counsel to the treasurer, but I think elected officials need to be in the room and being a part of the conversation, because at the end of the day, I think being a mayor is probably one of the most challenging jobs that you could possibly want, because somebody's doing something stupid at any point all the time, right? But these also, at the same time, they're responsible for thinking through these issues and making services available. So anyway, elected officials, I think, would be an interesting addition, just to make sure that they're thinking about, to your earlier question about policy, what policies are they putting together to make some of these things become more embedded in the day-to-days of the society, and would add rocket fuel to the work that we're all trying to do.
I think I'd add one thing now, hearing from everyone. I don't know if it's because of how long I've now been in this industry and how long I've been doing this work, but really invite anyone to the coalition that's willing to do the work. Right? Because we probably all sit in a lot of meetings with a lot of folks that are supposed to be at the table and should care, and really don't offer anything. So I would say the coalition needs organizations and people that want to do the work.
And then there's that. So, well, you hit a little bit about elected officials. Now, as we're, this topic is gaining a lot of attraction. What's the conversation that we should be having on the local, state, and federal level with elected officials?
I would say it looks like people are actually having conversations on the federal level. I know HUD just issued a notice discussing how they want to see rent reporting incorporated into public housing. So I think people are doing a good job of getting the information out, and it also gives us on a local level leverage to then make those moves. And so, relying on HUD, and thank you guys for doing that. Relying on HUD to give us sound advice on a lot of these things actually gives us a lot of leverage in the community.
Oh, you always have words of wisdom. Do you have an opinion on this, John? Okay, that's okay. Yeah, so I think the policies from at a state and local level, what we've been leaning in on is we think ensuring that people have a sense of belonging in their community is really important, right? And the way we envision having a sense of belonging in your community is through, we're leaning in significantly on municipal ID cards. Municipal ID cards initially started as a tool for undocumented workers to be, or undocumented individuals, not workers, to be a part of the community where they live. They popped up in New York, they're in Chicago, they're in Newark, they're in a couple of other cities, Detroit. But now we're seeing that they have actually the ability to make people feel as if they are, as Pete Buttigieg was talking about on the campaign stump for South Bend. We think that it not only does allow people to have a sense of belonging, but it enables you to drive engagement. And your municipal ID card can let you find out what your services are. You can use them to pay your bills. You can use it as a way to get free access to the zoo. So we have been spending a lot of our time talking that up and trying to encourage more and more cities to drive that, because it really becomes a way to bring everybody along and not just allow a city to sit with a small number of people.
Thank you. A lot of studies have started to happen and start to uncover that we have predatory landlords and practices that's by the landlords that's not so savory. So can you guys address anything about policies that may have or should be affecting landlords? I would say in the regards of maybe when an eviction is filed, before this landlord could rent to another tenant, especially if they're receiving any kind of funding, that the property should be cleared to be livable.
I know there's some new legislation that was just introduced by the senator from Missouri that deals with kind of slumlords and having some sort of database. Now, I don't know whether or not that's a good idea. I haven't read the actual legislation yet, but I know, especially in St. Louis, this has been a hot topic because we have had, in particular, one landlord that has been terrible. And there's a significant number of voucher holders from the city and the county that reside in their developments. And so something has to be done. We're thinking about that because we don't want that situation to ever happen again, where we have individuals living in developments that are deplorable. And so, yeah, so it's a tough question. And so I don't know how to answer it other than we have to be diligent in our inspection processes. We have to document everything that we see and follow up, essentially.
I'll give you one example in New York that we're familiar with, which is all the different, I think this happens in terms of housing, multifamily housing in New York City. There's a rating system of the various landlords, and that database is available to anybody to take a look at it, but it's not very easily accessible. So what a company did actually was they took all that data and made it very accessible to tenants, and they published the rating system for any landlord. And what ended up happening was people who were poorly rated, they're like, ooh, this is a problem. And they immediately changed their behavior, and they turned it into a marketing tool so they could increase their rating from a public perspective. So that was a good example, I thought, of just embarrassing people to change their behavior. But you have to, the city, the data in the case of New York City was available, but just was not easily accessible. So a company went out and changed the game on that. And so I think it's sometimes you got to embarrass people and make it visible, and that might be a great way to approach that problem in other cities.
I'd add that while rent reporting and the topics that we've been talking about today are, in and of themselves their own issues, they're not in a vacuum, right? That there are lots of other systems that touch on, what we've been talking about today. We talk about real economic opportunity. And so people need to be able to pay their rent, right? So we need to be looking at real economic systems as well as other family supports so that, families are not at risk of eviction, hopefully from a financial standpoint. Now, when you're talking about slum landlords, I know the neighborhood you're talking about very, very well, and this is where these other partners that we've been talking about are really important, whether they be the elected officials or anchor institutions. Here in St. Louis, I know that one neighborhood that was really struggling, the Washington University Medical Center came in and bought 2 of the 3 largest slum landlords in one entire neighborhood. And then they held onto those properties for approved developers to come in and rebuild, and they paid for the gap in how much it took to build the home versus, market prices in the neighborhood to really stabilize the community. So, I know there are some great anchor partners in that community as well. That's why the coalition, need to really consist of folks that have got some leverage, resources, and will.
So, Esther, if you can build on that a little bit for me. So I'm sitting here thinking about with versus to, and this conversation around eviction is really fascinating to me because I start thinking about the neighborhoods in which people are identifying that these slum landlords are in and have been in for a multitude of years, but if you track that to like community development efforts, they're like moving into those neighborhoods now, right? So I started thinking of, like, you talked about systems disruptions, and what does that look like to disrupt systems? Because people who are running systems are probably like, what does that mean? Especially if I'm running a government entity and you're saying, disrupt my system. But also building on that, like, what's the level of intentionality that you need when you're having a policy that affects individuals and you don't want to do any harm?
That is a great question, Donovan, one that I had not anticipated. So it's a fantastic question. So I would talk about the framework that we use, right? And we use a results framework that, one, is rooted in data. Data is really important. And 2, that data needs to be disaggregated so that we're not deploying a strategy that, again, is not actually addressing a true need on the ground. An example I like to give is inside our system, we have on staff someone that used to run the juvenile justice program for the state of Kentucky. And they implemented a program to divert youth out of detention centers and into diversionary programs. And after 1 year, they were successful, and 10,000 young people were, instead of being sent to detention centers, were sent through diversionary programs. When they disaggregated the data, not a single one was a youth of color, even though they're overrepresented in the youth justice system, right? So that is an example where we can oftentimes deploy policies that don't address the true need. The collaborative piece, no one organization can do this work alone. And so when we talk about not wanting to disrupt, not wanting to harm, right, but disrupting it's going to take collaboration, and it's going to take an intentionality that, by and large, takes a lot of will and energy from organizations. You know, often we talk a lot in our system about whether or not we are aligned with an organization, because I think inside our system we used to think that if you were an organization that did a lot of work, that you were an organization we wanted to partner with. Turns out that work wasn't aligned with anything and was not necessarily aligned with any sort of mission. So we need to ensure that we're aligning with partners that truly address the mission that we're trying to carry out. And then finally, the last two components of our framework are adaptive versus technical. I think we oftentimes go to the technical solution because it's easier. The adaptive is much, much harder. It requires behavior change. And I think that, especially when we're talking about housing, we have gotten so accustomed to using certain financial tools, doing revitalization in a certain way, that it's easy to get into that rhythm and not necessarily thinking outside the box. And the reality of it is given the current state of affordable housing in this country, we're going to have to figure out some more adaptive solutions rather than always looking to LIHTC or some of these other financial tools to get what we need to get done. And then finally, these, you know, what we call the mental models, or what we call person, role, and system. The reality of it is that it's people that are running these systems, and these systems are currently functioning in the way that they were meant to, and they are benefiting a lot of people. And if we want to disrupt those systems, it means that we're really going to have to be honest about what that means and who it's going to benefit. And think about that. You know, systems currently operate in the way that they were meant to, and that's any system. You know, whether it's urban strategies, a city, a federal department. So when we talk about disrupting systems, I mean, that's what we're talking about, is thinking about how we've been doing things historically in a different way.
Kind of coming from the government perspective, I will say systems don't always operate as they should. And so this is probably an unpopular opinion, but I welcome system disruptions because it only makes what I do better. I've been through lots of system disruptions in my tenure in government and working with HUD, and it has only made the organizations and departments that I work for better. What I would prefer is that residents would be the disruptors, that they would come to the meetings, they would participate, they will give us opinions and valuable advice. What we see is that doesn't happen. So usually the system disruptors are the networks, the coalitions, urban strategies, things like that. So again, system disruptions is not a negative thing. It really does make organizations better if you have the right leadership in the departments and they're willing to actually think critically about their operations.
So I echo what you just said, because if we continue to allow systems to operate the way they have been operating, and let's just say in St. Louis, and I know that in other places it's the same, we're talking about 60 to 7 years of systematic processes that have not invested in areas of color, so or minorities. And so we end up getting situations like what we had in Ferguson. You have where you have 80 to 90% of the population may be African American in that community, that small footprint. And you have roughly about 100% of the community controlled by people that don't look like them, and stopping to put them into a system where they're going into the court and they have to pay these fines, frivolous fines, and all of these different things. And where they was situated, 80% of the housing was subsidized housing without any type of amenities or anything to benefit within that little short footprint, whereas if you needed to take a trip to the airport where they were at, you would have had to go through so many different processes to get to the airports, which would take you about maybe an hour to get there. Whereas if you just had a car to drive or you had some direct transportation, it'd take you 10 minutes. You know, so all of those different things are based upon a system. Unless we can go in and we can disrupt some of those systems and tell the people or the organizations or the political folks, even HUD, federal government, we cannot continue to allow things to operate the way they have always operated. We didn't know that Section 8 and affordable subsidized housing was at that extent within that short, you know, in that small geographic footprint until something happened. Shame on us. We should have been tracking it, you know, as well and say, hey, you cannot concentrate people in these areas like that, and you need to have mobility, opportunity, and so forth. And I always think that the government and talking state, local, federal, say, okay, how can we do things better? We need people to come to us. We need people to talk to us. You know, the city, you know, and others need to know, hey, this is going to benefit you, you know, if we can bring about these changes within these communities.
So when, you know, at least for inside our system, when we talk about systems disruption, there is obviously the radical change, the, you know, protests to garner, you know, some significant amount of change. But there are also small changes that can happen that really disrupt the system. And I will give you an example, and it's here in St. Louis. Young people who were trying to get to work. And we don't have, our Metrolink system does not have a youth pass like a lot of major cities do. So if you're a young person and you're trying to get to your summer job, that regular Metrolink pass is quite expensive. And so what do? You don't pay. So you take a Metrolink ride, you get stopped by a Metrolink officer that is now on your record. You don't show up to court. You now have a warrant. You are 17 years old. So now we are talking about crossing multiple systems. We're talking about transit. We're talking about the juvenile justice. We're now talking law enforcement. When it would have just taken one bus pass, right? Something as simple as a bus pass would have disrupted that entire system. So in that example, it's not protesting. It's not like this violent upheaval. It is a conversation across multiple systems to identify a serious problem for young people that starts out as wanting to save $2 and then turning into a bench warrant.
In the system disruption conversation, some systems are working just fine from somebody's perspective. So the disruption in my mind, part of it comes from you got to change. If you also got to cut off the head of the snake. I mean, you got to change who's at the head of it if you want to create different disruption. And I was having a conversation with somebody earlier about change in organizations, and that moving people out of roles opens up an opportunity to have different kinds of conversations. So I think part of systems disruption is what you talked about in terms of people. Systems disruption may follow on people disruption in order to change that.
Okay. This question regards policies around some of the carnage that was left behind when the real estate market burst, and some of that carnage is blight in our community. There have been buildings, at least in Milwaukee, I can speak for sure, that's been left to basically fall apart in front of your eyes. And we all know the way that you look at your community and see your community is a direct correlation to how you feel and act sometimes. Do you guys see any policies, working across systems and agencies, elected officials, private entities, to knock down blighted buildings that have no redemptive value?
In St. Louis, we have something called the Vacancy Collaborative, and I would say it took years and years and years and years for us to get to this point. But the Vacancy Collaborative brings universities, it brings elected officials, it brings residents and community organizations all together to help find a remedy for vacant properties. One thing that we know is that our population in the city of St. Louis is very low compared to where it was in the 50s. And so we don't really need as many housing units that we had when we're at our peak. But it doesn't mean that you let the buildings just fall and crumble. That means you come up with viable solutions. And I think now we're at a point at the city level where people are actually thinking about it. And I think that's part of it, bringing everyone to the table and just generating ideas. For a long time, we had no real ideas. And so I think that's half of the battle, bringing everyone together, coming up with a coalition, and then just having kind of a brain dump of ideas.
So one, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I would say in particularly when you want to preserve some of the brick, you want to preserve some of the architectural features, it does take a little bit of deliberate action to demo a building. We have a program here where as much architectural history and antique type things are preserved from the buildings. And so you don't want to just rip the brick down, you want to take it down in a way that can be used again in other homes. So I could see it actually being pretty expensive and pretty time consuming.
Yeah. There's the land bank concept is one that has worked very effectively in Detroit. And so, and in fact, they're copying it in Newark. And that's actually relevant to this conversation. So, in the case of Newark, they've got approximately 1,000 properties. About 600 of them are buildings that are in some form of either completion or abandonment, and the other 40% or so are odd lots. And so what they've done is they've basically sort of done a sort of an eminent domain idea, and then so they're going to turn around and sell them to the individuals to encourage home ownership. In the case of odd lots, the odd lots, I think the price is under $10,000. They're side lots and part of somebody's next to somebody's property, and the natural buyer actually is already right there. They try to give them away. They call it the Valentine's Day Massacre or something like that a couple years ago, and people got the properties and gave them back because they hadn't had the conversation around here's how much it costs once you acquire the property. Here's how your credit score is going to impact your ability to finance it. And so I actually think those strategies, so they're doing it again, and we're actually partnering with the city of Newark to be able to provide financial coaching, education, improve the credit score. How can you finance either an odd lot? We might finance some of them ourselves because there's not really a product in the market for a $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 loan for a piece of property, or help the banks who have CRA issues recognize that the customer that they might lend to has come through our system, and they should help them buy that larger property that's not an odd lot. So there are some interesting policy strategies. I think Detroit gets the gold star around that, and it might be worth thinking about replicating that.
I would echo what Wale said about Detroit. I think there's a lot of cities who are starting to focus on how do we warehouse our real estate differently and being really intentional about that. If you haven't seen, there's a lot of speculators across the country who are looking at mid-sized cities, especially cities in the Midwest, and they're speculating. They're really producing reports, really data-driven reports that talks about how to hold real estate in those particular neighborhoods. And it's the beginning of redlining all over again. Literally, they're rating neighborhoods, saying that this is prime for redevelopment, this is this, this is that. And it's really going to create this whole idea of how urban cores are redefined. So we have to be really intentional about what's the conversation from both a policy but an action perspective of how we are in front of that so that we don't look up in 20 years and our urban cores look really different, extremely different, and all of the people without access are now in the first stream suburbs, and everyone with access is now back in the urban core. So we want to be very intentional about that. And this brings me to my last question around this connectivity. Housing, I feel like this conversation around rental credit reporter is so tied to housing. And you three are just like extremely brilliant leaders and really pushing your organizations forward. So, but who else needs to be accountable for this conversation? You know, you leave these summits and you're like, oh my God, that was amazing. I learned so much. And then you come to the next summit and you're like, oh, I learned some more. And so part of our system, we talk about who's accountable to continue this conversation and really push an agenda of action forward. So who are the people who should be accountable to continuing this conversation and really moving it from talk to action?
I would say the simple answer is everyone. Everyone is accountable. I think everyone in this room is accountable for taking the information learned and telling other people. That's me going back to my office, talking to my staff about this, coming up with a plan, a policy, talking to HUD about it, things like that. But again, it's a personal accountability to seeing what we need to be seen in our cities. I mean, we live here, we work here. It is really our obligation to make it as good as it can be.
And I would agree with that thought and add that I think that everyone's also accountable for, ensuring that this conversation is transparent, which I think that it has been, and that we continue that so that we're pushing it to a point where the policy it really does create equitable outcomes. And not just an outcome, but equitable outcomes for the families that we're trying to serve.
And I'd echo everything that everyone said. I might add my own wrinkle to it, which is sustainable, equitable outcomes, right? And to the extent that I think of it from a lens of these are business opportunities, right? And there's a McKinsey study that came out recently that looks at the racial wealth gap. And I'll get the statistics wrong, but you get the gist of it, right? That if we're able to close the racial wealth gap, that's going to create, some multiple billions of dollars of value, right? And who wouldn't want to be able to sort of tap into that? And so if you create a sustainable model and you look at these as market opportunities and we really figure out what that looks like, that's an opportunity for HUD, that's an opportunity for Equifax, that's an opportunity for Yardi, that's an opportunity for the philanthropic community, that's an opportunity for us. So I think the accountability is like, how do we think about shifting the conversation from, geez, this is a drain on resources, to, hey, this is a way to create value and move communities forward. And if we think about it that way, we'll have a different conversation a year from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now.
All right, let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Thank you, Donovan. Thank you, Esther. I'm going to do my best David Stifler impression and just be brief as he would be. And just thank you again for hanging with us for our second annual Rental Solutions Summit. I believe that we've got momentum to do this again next year. I suspect that we will have even bigger things to talk about. I want to just say thank you to our out-of-town guests, City of Milwaukee, City of Seattle. Thank you for joining us. For all the folks that are from Atlanta and St. Louis, for the other cities that I'm forgetting, for folks from Newark and New York City, and I think there's Philadelphia in the house. Thank you. Thank you for caring about the subject. Thank you for caring enough to come here, to be transparent, to really roll up your sleeves, and let's all go and convert this to action in 2020. Thank you so much.